Is it the case that none of us are morally responsible for our actions? Is it a mistake to blame people for doing things that we consider to be wrong, or to give them moral credit when they do something we consider heroic? Here's the basic argument. Premise number one, moral responsibility requires free will. This means that if free will doesn't exist, then none of us can be morally responsible for our actions. Premise number two, free will doesn't exist, and therefore moral responsibility doesn't exist either. It's a simple argument. It has the same form as saying that if you need eggs to cook an omelet and you have no eggs, then you aren't cooking an omelet. If you need free will for moral responsibility and there's no free will, then there's no moral responsibility. The argument, as written, conforms to a basic form of argument that those who study logic identify as modus tollens. This is a valid argument form. This means that if the two premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. What remains is to show that both premises are in fact true. Let's look at the first premise, that moral responsibility requires free will. Is this true? What reasons are there to believe that morality requires free will? To defend this premise, we're going to construct a new argument with this premise as its conclusion. The first premise in our supporting argument is that the body is made up of atoms. Atoms form molecules, and molecules form muscles, nerves, and neurotransmitters. Let's imagine a hypothetical agent who walks into a store, picks up something on a shelf, slips it into his coat pocket, and then walks out without paying. Imagine that this is a classic example of shoplifting. The individual was walking through the store, saw something they wanted but did not need, put it in their pocket, and left. One thing we can say is that in his hand there is a carbon atom, and this carbon atom moved. If we're holding this person morally responsible for his action, then we're holding him morally responsible for a set of facts, which includes the motion of this carbon atom. To hold somebody morally responsible for some action is to hold that person morally responsible for the motion of the atoms in his body. A person is being held morally responsible for the fact that his finger pulled the trigger, or his tongue told a lie, or something belonging to somebody else ended up in his pocket. What then caused the atom to move? We have three options. Either it was caused to move by the determined laws of nature, or it was caused to move by the randomness of quantum mechanics, or it was caused to move by a free act of the agent's will. Perhaps the atom itself was pushed by the forces of physics, but what influenced those forces of physics to push the carbon atom? And what influenced the influencers? As we trace this chain of causes into the past, every prior cause had to either be a determined law of physics, the randomness of quantum mechanics, or a free act of some will. A contraction of some muscle may have caused the atom to move, and some electrical signal from the brain may have caused the muscle to contract. As we trace these causes back in time, we get either a determined physical force, a random force, or an act of free will. Don't worry about the randomness thing for now. We'll discuss it in a bit. Focus for now on actions caused by determined laws of physics. As we can't be held morally responsible for the effects of the determined laws of physics. Imagine that I'm a surgeon with a bit of a malevolent streak. I perform surgery to repair your broken leg. While I'm performing the surgery, I secretly implant an electronic device that will cause your calf muscle to contract in exactly 1 year's time. Exactly 1 year later, you're driving down the street when my device goes off. The muscle contracts, your foot goes down on the accelerator, and you race into an intersection, causing a serious accident. It'd be absurd to say that the accident was your fault. Yes, it was your leg muscle that contracted, causing your foot to push down on the accelerator, causing the accident. However, so long as your leg muscle contracting was itself caused by the determined laws of physics, you're not morally responsible. Once the doctors examine your leg and find the device, you'll be exonerated, and I'll have already fled the country. We can't be held morally responsible for the determined laws of physics. If we can't be held responsible for the determined laws of physics, what about being held responsible for some random happening that theory suggests sometimes happens at the subatomic level? To consider whether moral responsibility is compatible with randomness, imagine that you're on trial for shoplifting. Your defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney get together as the judge looks on. They flip a coin, heads you're guilty, tails you're innocent. It's important to note here that they're not flipping the coin to determine if they're going to say that you are innocent or guilty. They're saying that the coin toss determines your actual guilt or innocence. The coin toss determines if you are actually guilty or actually innocent. And it's not because this is a magical coin that lands heads if you're guilty and tails if you're innocent. This is a regular coin, and how it lands determines your guilt or innocence. You might say that this is ridiculous. The random flip of a coin cannot determine if somebody is innocent or guilty. You'd be right. That would be my point. Many scientists believe that there's an element of randomness at the level of the smallest units of matter. We don't have to understand this to know that randomness cannot be the source of moral guilt or innocence. If we're looking for what makes some people morally guilty and others morally innocent, it is not to be found in the random flip of a quantum coin. And this leads us to our conclusion. Moral responsibility requires free will. We listed 3 possible causes for movement of the molecules in one's hand while one shoplifted an item. These are the determined laws of physics, the randomness of quantum theory, or free will. We've eliminated 2 of these options, the determined laws of physics and the randomness of quantum theory. We're left with only one option. Moral responsibility requires free will. To be guilty of shoplifting, you must have a free act of the will, not the laws of physics or some random flip of a quantum coin. But could it have actually been a free act of the will? If we dismiss the determined laws of physics and the randomness of quantum mechanics, is there anything left? Okay, now back with our original argument. I've given an argument defending the first premise. Whether it be shoplifting an item, pulling a trigger, telling a lie, or speeding through an intersection, it requires the motion of matter. The motion of matter could either be caused by the determined laws of physics, or randomness, or one's free will. We can't be held responsible for the determined laws of physics or of randomness. We can only be held responsible for the acts of our free will. If the second premise also turns out to be true, and the one thing that moral responsibility requires doesn't exist, then moral responsibility itself doesn't exist. So let's look to see if premise 2 is true. Once again, we're going to construct a supporting argument, this time supporting premise 2 by having premise 2 as its conclusion. Here, I'm just going to appeal to physics. Physicists have spent a great deal of time studying motion of matter, large and small, and nowhere in their observations have they had a need to postulate the existence of anything remotely like free will. We can account for everything around us, particularly at the level of human behavior, in terms of the determined laws of nature. Photons strike our eyes, sending signals to the brain, which interact with other signals and ultimately produces behavior. There's no room for free will in the causal chain. This doesn't prove that free will doesn't exist, but it certainly argues that we have no reason to believe in its existence, no evidence for its existence. Yet evidence is required before we can say that an act is wrong. We have to be able to say that the act springs from a free will that, for as far as we can tell, never existed. At this point, a voice from the back of the room might tell us to wait. There is something that can't be explained without our capacity for free will, and that's our ability to make choices. We deliberate about whether to perform this or that action. I was recently deliberating about whether I should continue to work on this presentation or take a break. Why would I be deliberating about whether to continue to work on this presentation or take a break if these were not genuine options, unless it were in some sense, real and important sense, possible for me to either be continuing to work on this presentation or to take a break? So to put this in the form of an argument, what we're looking at here is an argument that says that free will is required to explain something we see happening all the time in the real world. We see people deliberating and making choices. The first premise states that our ability to deliberate and make choices makes no sense unless there is free will. We do deliberate and make choices, therefore we must be able to freely choose among those options. Whether this argument holds any weight depends on whether both of the premises are true. I want to start with the second premise. As mentioned above, this appears to be obviously true for anybody who's had to make a decision. People constantly deliberate. Should I go to work today or call in sick? Should I accept that job in Denver? What classes should I take next semester? Much of our life is spent deliberating. It's difficult to see how this premise might be false. So to argue that free will does not exist, one would have to argue against the first premise. When we make choices, we see two or more possible futures ahead of us. If free will doesn't exist, if there was no free will, then this whole perception of having a fork in the road and needing to select which one to travel on is a joke. One way to show that the first premise is false is to provide an example of something deliberating and making choices, but which doesn't have free will. The best way to prove that black swans are possible is to show people a black swan. The best way to prove that deliberation and choice without free will is possible is to show something engaged in deliberation and choice that doesn't have free will. To show that deliberation and choice are possible without free will, I'm going to use the example of a computer programmed to play chess. This program will deliberate about which pieces to move and then choose from among the available options. However, the machine will not have free will. Anybody with a pencil and paper going through the code will be able to predict exactly which option the computer will select in any given situation. Still, the computer will choose that option through a process of deliberation that selects it from among a range of options. First, a program will loop through all 16 potential pieces in the game that they may have on their side. For each piece that it considers, it'll go through a second loop that considers each legal move for that piece. For each legal move, it will calculate a value for that move. So how does the program compute this value? For each move, the computer will determine which propositions will be made or kept true by that move. Each proposition will be assigned a value, so it will compute the value of those propositions being made or kept true. Let me provide an example. The computer assigns a value of 9 to the proposition that the move will result in taking the opponent's queen. So if, in computing a move, it computes that the value of the enemy queen is taken is true, then the value of 9 will be added to that move. The computer determines the sum of all of the propositions made true. Note that some propositions, such as the proposition my queen can be taken on the next turn, will have a negative value. After the program has considered and evaluated all of the various options, it then selects the option with the highest value. Now, this is a fully determined system. Nobody has discovered how to program free will into a computer. However, at the same time, the program considers options, assigns a value to each option based on which propositions will be made true, and the value of those propositions being made true. And it then selects the option with the highest value. Let me put this all back in context. The original argument stated that moral responsibility does not exist because free will doesn't exist. And free will doesn't exist, or at least we have no evidence of its existence, because it's not needed to explain anything in the universe. This was disputed. The critic claimed that free will was needed to explain choice. However, the chess-playing computer shows that deliberation, the consideration of options, and the choosing of an option with the highest value doesn't require free will. So we do not, in fact, have an example of something that requires free will. This means that the premise that there's no such thing as free will, or at least there's no evidence of free will, the original premise 2, still stands. We defended premise 1 earlier, and this is a valid argument form. So if both premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. There's no such thing as moral responsibility. This then is the argument that we'll be considering through this set of videos. It's an argument that states that the whole idea of moral responsibility is a fiction. In the next video, I'll look at an argument that aims to question the truth of premise 1. It admits that free will doesn't exist, but says that moral responsibility still makes sense.